Working as a delivery driver isn't glamorous, but after being laid off from my accounting job during COVID, it became my lifeline. I've been doing this for almost 3 years now, and I've developed a routine. I know which neighborhoods tip well, which apartment complexes are a nightmare to navigate, and which routes to avoid during rush hour. I work for one of those major delivery companies, the ones with the brown trucks. And while most days blur together, there's one delivery I'll never forget. Last Halloween, I picked up an extra night shift. The holiday season was approaching, and I needed the extra cash to help pay off some medical bills. My regular route covers the eastern part of Minneapolis, mostly residential areas and small businesses. The weather that day was typical Minnesota fall, crisp and cold with scattered clouds and that distinct smell of decaying leaves in the air. The shift started normally enough. I'd been delivering since 2 p.m., watching the sun set behind the city skyline while methodically working through my delivery queue. Kids in costumes started appearing on the streets around 6 p.m., and I found myself handing out candy from the small bag I kept in my truck, something many of us drivers do during Halloween. By 9:30 p.m., I was ahead of schedule. The streets had quieted down, most trick-or-treaters had gone home, and I had just a few deliveries left. I remember checking my phone, 89% battery, which was unusual for that time of night. I typically had to plug in my backup battery pack by 7 p.m., but I'd recently upgraded to a new phone with better battery life. The GPS directed me to Cedar Mill Road for my next delivery. I'd never been there before, which wasn't unusual. Minneapolis has hundreds of residential streets I've never delivered to. The neighborhood started normally enough with modern homes and well-maintained lawns. Halloween decorations were still illuminated, though most porch lights had been turned off, signaling the end of trick-or-treating. As I drove deeper into the neighborhood, the houses became older, more traditional Minnesota architecture. The streetlights grew further apart, creating pools of yellow light with long stretches of darkness between them. My GPS indicated the delivery was at the very end of the street. I'd been doing this job long enough to develop a sixth sense about certain situations. Sometimes you just know when something isn't right. As I approached the end of Cedar Mill Road, that feeling started creeping in. The temperature display in my truck showed a sudden drop from 48 to 39 degrees, which seemed odd. The house itself wasn't particularly remarkable, a 2-story Victorian style common in older Minneapolis neighborhoods. No Halloween decorations, no porch light, just a well-maintained exterior that somehow seemed too perfect for its age. The brass house numbers matched my delivery information, 1147. I remember sitting in my truck for a moment, checking the delivery details one last time. It was a small package, lightweight, with neat handwriting on the label. Nothing unusual, except for a slight discoloration around the edges, like it had been sitting in water but dried completely. Before I could even grab my scanner, movement caught my eye. The front door opened, and an elderly woman stepped into view. She wore a dark dress that seemed oddly formal for a Halloween night at home. Her gray hair was pulled back neatly, and despite the darkness, I could see her features clearly, as if she was illuminated by some unseen light source. "Marcus, dear, we've been waiting for you," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the night air despite the distance. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't told her my name. I hadn't even scanned the package, which is when customers usually see our names on their delivery notifications. I hadn't even stepped out of my truck. "Come on up, everyone's excited to see you," she continued, maintaining that same unnaturally clear tone. "We've been planning this for quite some time." That's when I noticed movement behind her in the house. The interior was dark, but I could make out what looked like several people moving around. I heard what sounded like whispers, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. The whispers seemed to grow louder, becoming a subtle hum that made my ears pop. My phone chose that moment to die, screen going black, despite the 89% battery I'd seen just minutes earlier. The truck's temperature display was now showing 33 degrees, and I could see my breath in the air. "Marcus," the woman called again, her voice taking on an edge that made my skin crawl. "Don't be rude. Everyone's waiting." More figures had appeared behind her, just dark shapes in the doorway. The whispers grew louder, and I could now make out my name being repeated over and over, in different voices, some high, some low. some barely above a breath. I'm not ashamed to admit that I panicked. I put my truck in reverse so quickly I nearly hit the curb. As I turned to drive away, I caught one last glimpse of the house in my side mirror. The woman still stood in the doorway, but now the entire entrance was filled with figures, all perfectly still, all watching my truck. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, parked under the bright lights, and tried to calm down. My phone suddenly came back to life, showing the same 89% battery as before. I had several missed calls from my supervisor about the undelivered package. When I called him back, he was surprisingly understanding. Apparently, several drivers had refused nighttime deliveries to that address before, though he couldn't tell me why, said those incidents weren't properly documented in the system. The next morning, I drove back to Cedar Mill Road, thinking daylight would help make sense of what happened. But when I reached the end of the street, I couldn't find house number 1147. The road ended at 1145, with a small wooded area beyond it. I checked my delivery history, but the address showed up as corrupted data, just a string of random characters where the house number should be. I spent several days trying to make sense of what happened. I looked up property records, asked other drivers about their experiences, and even drove by that street a few more times. The house never reappeared, and I never found any record of its existence. I still work as a delivery driver, but I've made significant changes to how I operate. I thoroughly verify addresses before accepting routes now. I keep detailed records of every delivery, including photos and GPS coordinates. I've installed a dash cam in my truck, and most importantly, I don't make deliveries to unfamiliar dead-end streets after dark. Some of my coworkers think I'm being overly cautious, but they weren't there that night. They didn't see how that woman looked at me, like she knew exactly who I was and had been waiting for this specific moment. They didn't hear those whispers or feel the unnatural cold that settled in my bones. The thing that still bothers me most isn't the disappearing house or the mysterious woman. It's what I discovered a few weeks later when reviewing my dashcam footage from other deliveries. Sometimes, in the background of routine stops, I catch glimpses of an elderly woman in a dark dress watching from a distance. She's never in the same place twice, and she's always gone when I look back at the footage a second time. But I know it's her, and I know she's still waiting. I've considered finding another job, but delivery work is what I know now. So I keep driving my routes, staying vigilant, and hoping I never hear someone say, "We've been waiting," ever again. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. Living in suburban Connecticut, Halloween has always been a neighborhood event. Last year, my 11-year-old daughter Emma was finally going trick-or-treating without me. She'd be with 3 friends from school, a small group we parents had coordinated through a group chat with an agreed route and curfew. I spent the early evening on our porch, handing out candy and monitoring the group chat. Around 7:30 p.m., Emma's first message about the man came through. Someone in a white mask and blue coat had been following their group. I didn't think much of it. Halloween brings out all sorts of people in costumes. 10 minutes later, her tone changed. The man was maintaining exactly 3 houses of distance behind them. When they sped up, he sped up. When they crossed the street, he crossed too. The girls even tested this by stopping at the Wilsons' house longer than usual. He just stood there 3 houses back, watching them through a plain white mask that covered his entire face. I tried calling Emma, but her phone was having battery issues again. The next message came from Lily's phone. They'd tried losing him by cutting through yards and switching streets, but he followed every move, always keeping that exact distance. Something about the precision of it made my skin crawl. The messages kept coming. They'd turn down Oak Street, he'd follow. They'd cross through the Reynolds yard, he'd use the same path moments later. Never rushing, never aggressive, just calmly maintaining that 3-house gap like it was the most natural thing in the world. I grabbed my keys and called John, Lily's dad. He was already heading out too. The girls had started zigzagging through the neighborhood's grid pattern, but their follower matched every turn. By the time we reached them, they were huddled on the Mortons' front porch, visibly shaken. Mrs. Morton, our retired neighbor, had brought them inside when she noticed their distress. Through her window, I could see the girls clustered around her kitchen table, their Halloween costumes now seeming out of place with their frightened expressions. The man was gone, but all 4 girls described him identically. Tall, around 6 feet, wearing what looked like a handmade white mask with small eye holes and no other features. His blue wool coat seemed too formal and heavy for the weather. What struck me most was how they all emphasized his movement. Never hurried, never threatening, just methodically maintaining that distance. We drove each girl home, constantly checking our mirrors. Emma sat silently in my car, her Wednesday Addams makeup smeared from crying. At home, she followed me around as I checked every lock twice. She made me look under her bed, in her closet, behind her curtains. All the places kids think monsters hide. Except this time, there had been a real monster out there. I stayed up, watching our security cameras and listening to every sound. At 2:47 a.m., my phone lit up with a text from Mike next door. He worked nights at the hospital and had cameras covering both our properties. His message was brief. "Check your backyard. Now." My cameras showed nothing, but Mike sent me a clip from his system. The footage showed the man in the white mask and blue coat, standing motionless in my backyard. He wasn't trying to break in or vandalize anything, just standing there, head tilted up toward Emma's second-floor window. The timestamp showed he'd been there for 23 minutes. I called 911 while running to Emma's room. She was asleep as I closed her blinds and moved her to my room. By the time police arrived, he was gone. They searched the area and took statements, but found nothing. They increased patrols in our neighborhood for several weeks after. The investigation revealed nothing. The security footage quality was too poor for facial recognition, and no other cameras in the neighborhood had caught him coming or going. The detective noted something odd about Mike's footage. In the entire 23 minutes, the figure never moved. Not a shift in position, not a turn of the head, not even the subtle movement of breathing. The next few months were a blur of security upgrades and therapy appointments. We installed more cameras, motion sensors, and got a trained protection dog. Emma started seeing a trauma specialist. She'd wake up convinced she could see a white face at her window, even though we were on the second floor. Sarah and Madison's families moved away within months. Emma switched schools to be with Lily, the only friend who really understood what happened. We developed new safety routines. Emma stopped going out after dark. I started working from home more often. The police investigation is still technically open, but they've stopped actively pursuing leads. The detective initially assigned to our case retired, and his replacement seems skeptical of a Halloween scare from last year. But the security footage still exists, showing those 23 minutes of unnatural stillness in my backyard. Emma doesn't talk about that night anymore, but I notice how she counts houses when we drive anywhere. 3 houses ahead, 3 houses behind. Always checking that distance. Always watching for a white mask and blue coat. The neighborhood still does Halloween, but we keep our lights off now. Some things aren't worth risking, even if most people think we're just being paranoid about a Halloween prank gone wrong. Working night shifts in pediatrics wasn't my first choice, but as a new nurse at Boston Children's Hospital, I had to start somewhere. The overnight shift differential helped with my student loans, and I actually enjoyed the quieter atmosphere. Most nights were routine. Medication rounds, checking vitals, and comforting the occasional child who couldn't sleep. Halloween night started like any other shift. I arrived at 7 p.m., got my patient assignments from the day nurse, and settled in for my 12 hours. The pediatric ward was on the 4th floor of the main building, connected to the older East Wing by a long corridor. That wing had been partially closed for renovations, with only a few administrative offices still in use during the day. The kids were excited about Halloween, even in the hospital. We decorated the ward with paper pumpkins and friendly ghosts, and some of the staff wore costume accessories with their scrubs. I had cat ears on with my blue scrubs, nothing too scary for the children. Around 10 p.m., I was doing my rounds when I first noticed something off. The temperature in the corridor seemed colder than usual. Our building was old, so temperature fluctuations weren't uncommon. But this felt different, like walking through a pocket of winter air. I made a mental note to mention it to maintenance. The night progressed normally until around 2 a.m. I was heading to the medication room when I heard it, a soft humming coming from the direction of the east wing. It sounded like a child's voice, but not quite right. The melody was unfamiliar, something that made my skin crawl without knowing why. I checked the patient roster on my tablet. All our pediatric patients were accounted for in their rooms. Sometimes parents would walk with restless children, but at this hour, most were asleep. The humming continued, echoing slightly in the empty corridor. Protocol required investigating any unusual sounds. We couldn't risk a confused patient wandering around. I walked toward the east wing, my footsteps sounding too loud on the linoleum floor. The motion sensor lights flickered on as I approached the connecting corridor, casting harsh fluorescent light on the pale green walls. That's when I noticed the smell. Hospitals have distinctive odors: antiseptic, cleaning supplies, hospital food. This was different. It reminded me of my grandmother's basement after a flood, damp, musty, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. The connecting corridor had a security door that required badge access. It was designed to prevent unauthorized access to the renovation area, but as I approached, I saw it was slightly ajar. The humming was clearer now, coming from the stairwell just beyond the door. I pushed the door open, already rehearsing what I'd say to a wandering patient or parent. The stairwell lights were motion-activated too, but they seemed dimmer than usual. As they flickered on, I saw the handprints. They were small, child-sized, and smeared along the wall in what looked like blood. They started at about waist height and led up the stairs, as if someone small had been steadying themselves while climbing. The blood looked fresh, still wet in places. I immediately called security on my radio, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported the situation. They said they'd send someone to check it out. While waiting, I heard footsteps above me, light, quick steps running up the stairs. But when I looked up, I couldn't see anyone. The security guard Dave arrived a few minutes later. He was a familiar face, having worked at the hospital for over a decade. He examined the handprints and radioed his supervisor. They'd had reports of teenagers breaking into the renovation area earlier that evening, probably playing Halloween pranks. Dave suggested it was likely fake blood from a Halloween costume. He pointed out some glitter in one of the smears, the kind you'd find in costume makeup. His explanation made sense, but something still felt wrong. The humming had stopped, but that sickly sweet smell was stronger now. While Dave called maintenance for cleanup, I heard those footsteps again. This time they were coming down the stairs, but when I looked, there was nothing there, just those small, bloody handprints leading upward. The rest of my shift was uneventful. Maintenance cleaned the stairwell, security did extra rounds, and all our patients remained safely in their beds. But every time I passed that security door, I heard faint humming, just at the edge of hearing. The next day, I learned more about the East Wing's history. It had been the original children's ward back in the 1960s, before the modern pediatric unit was built. An older nurse mentioned there had been a serious fire in that wing, though she didn't know the details. I started researching during my breaks. The fire had happened on Halloween night in 1963. 3 children had died, smoke inhalation while trying to escape through the stairwell. The article mentioned they'd been found on the upper floors, suggesting they'd run up instead of down, possibly confused by the smoke. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more things. The security door would be ajar despite being checked and locked. The smell would come and go, always stronger near the stairwell. Sometimes I'd hear that humming, always just distant enough to make me doubt what I was hearing. I requested a transfer to day shift the following week. My supervisor approved it without question. Apparently, I wasn't the first night nurse to make that request. The day shift meant a pay cut, but it was worth it. My last night shift, I had to use that stairwell when the elevator was down for maintenance. As I started down the stairs, I heard running footsteps coming up. The steps were light, like a child's, but fast, too fast to be normal. The motion lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I felt something brush past me. Small hands touching my arm. They felt wet. I work day shifts now, in the new pediatric wing. Sometimes I see the renovation crews in the East Wing, But the work seems to be taking longer than planned. They keep running into problems, electrical issues, unexplained water damage, strange sounds in the walls. Last week, I overheard 2 maintenance workers talking about handprints they'd found while stripping old wallpaper in the East Wing. Small handprints, high up on the walls, in what looked like decades-old blood. They were going to document it for the renovation records, but when they came back with a camera, the wallpaper had already been cleared away. The hospital administration is talking about demolishing the East Wing completely. The renovation costs keep mounting, and there are structural issues they hadn't anticipated. I still pass that security door during shift changes, but I don't look down the corridor anymore. Some things are better left alone, especially when you can still hear children humming on the other side. Buying a house as a single parent isn't easy, but after years of saving and a decent promotion at work, I finally found a place within my budget. The previous owners had maintained it well, a 2-story colonial in a quiet Massachusetts suburb. My daughter Sarah, 8 at the time, fell in love with the bay window in what would become her bedroom. The house needed some updates, but nothing major. The inspection revealed typical older home issues, some outdated wiring, a few drafty windows. The only real quirk was the basement door, which had an unusually sturdy lock installed. The realtor mentioned it was probably added during a previous renovation. The basement itself was unfinished but dry, with concrete floors and stone foundation walls. We moved in during early October. Sarah adjusted quickly, making friends with kids down the street. I decided to host a Halloween party, thinking it would help us connect with neighbors and let Sarah show off her new home to her friends. Nothing fancy, just some decorations, snacks, and candy for trick-or-treaters. The week before Halloween, Sarah mentioned seeing someone peeking out from the basement doorway. Kids have active imaginations, especially in new houses, so I assured her it was probably shadows from the heating vent above the door. Still, I double-checked the lock that night. It was secure, as always. Halloween night started normally. Parents from the neighborhood brought their kids over, all in costumes. Sarah and her friends ran around upstairs while the adults chatted in the kitchen. Around 8 p.m., I headed to the basement to grab more paper towels from our storage shelves. The basement door was open, not slightly ajar, but wide open. The lock, which I distinctly remembered checking earlier, hung loose on the frame. The light from the hallway cast long shadows down the basement stairs. I assumed one of the kids had managed to unlock it somehow, though I couldn't figure out how. The lock was old but solid, and I kept the key in my bedroom. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and headed down to get the paper towels. The basement air felt different, damp and unusually cold for October. My flashlight beam caught something on the far wall that hadn't been there during my last trip down. Children's drawings done in crayon, not the neat planned artwork you'd hang on a fridge, but aggressive scribbles in dark colors. The crayon marks looked wet, like they'd been drawn minutes ago. I heard footsteps upstairs and called out, thinking some kids had sneaked down earlier. No response. The drawings seemed to extend along the wall, disappearing behind some storage boxes. As I moved closer, I noticed they formed a pattern. Crude stick figures, all holding hands in a circle. In the center was a larger figure drawn in black. My phone's flashlight flickered. In that moment of darkness, I heard what sounded like crayons rolling across the concrete floor. When the light stabilized, there were fresh marks on the wall next to me, still wet, the waxy surface glistening in the beam. I ran upstairs, trying to stay calm in front of the party guests. I closed the basement door and locked it, pocketing the key. The rest of the party went fine. Parents complimented our decorations, kids got their candy, and no one seemed to notice anything wrong. After everyone left and Sarah was in bed, I went back to the basement with better lighting. The drawings were still there, but something was different. The circle of figures now had names written above them, messy, childish writing I didn't recognize. One of them was Sarah. I spent the next day cleaning the walls, but the crayon marks wouldn't come off completely. I bought heavy-duty cleaning supplies and while scrubbing, noticed dates written in tiny numbers near the floor. The most recent was from 1987, but others went back to the 1960s. Research at the local library revealed nothing dramatic. No missing children, no tragic accidents. The house had changed hands several times, always sold for normal reasons like job relocations or downsizing. But I did find a small article from 1963 about a local teacher who'd run an unauthorized special study group from her home basement. The article was vague about details, but the teacher had apparently left town suddenly. I installed a new lock on the basement door and sealed it with additional deadbolts. For good measure, I added a motion sensor camera facing the door. That's when things got worse. The first few nights were quiet. Then the camera started sending notifications to my phone at random hours. The footage always showed the same thing, the door slowly opening on its own, though all locks remained engaged. I'd go down to check, find it wide open, and lock it again. Sarah's behavior changed too. She started avoiding the hallway near the basement door. One morning over breakfast, she told me about the children she saw peeking out sometimes. Not just one anymore, but several. She described them as looking sad, like they were waiting for something. I called a contractor to permanently seal the door. He seemed confused by the multiple locks but didn't ask questions. He sealed it completely, even adding a metal plate for good measure. That night I heard scratching sounds from behind the door. The next morning it was open again. The metal plate had been bent outward, though the locks were still technically engaged. On the basement wall a new drawing had appeared, a circle of stick figures larger than before with Sarah drawn in the center. We moved out that week, breaking our lease and leaving most of our basement storage behind. The property management company was surprisingly understanding, mentioning that previous tenants had similar concerns about the basement. Sarah's happier in our new apartment, though she still talks about the children sometimes. She says they wanted her to join their special group and learn their secrets. Last week she brought home a drawing from school, a circle of stick figures with a larger figure in the center. Her teacher had written a concerned note about the unusually dark themes. The house is back on the market. The listing mentions the basement has been completely renovated, all traces of the old walls covered with fresh drywall. But the local real estate websites show it's been pending sale 3 times, with each deal falling through during final walkthrough. The latest listing photos show the basement door has been removed entirely, replaced with a wall. Sometimes I check the photos and in each new set, that wall seems to bulge out just a little more. Thompson's Farm had been a fall tradition in our area for generations. My wife and I used to go there for hay rides when we were dating, and after she passed away last year, I promised myself I'd keep taking our son Tyler there every October. He was 5 now, and this would be our first visit without her. The farm had changed little over the years. Same wooden welcome sign, same gravel parking lot, same red barn standing sentinel over acres of pumpkin fields. That Saturday morning was perfect for photos. Crisp autumn air, golden sunlight, and just enough clouds to prevent harsh shadows. Tyler was excited about picking his own pumpkin. I brought my good camera, hoping to capture some moments that would help him remember these traditions. The farm was busy but not crowded, with families scattered across the pumpkin patches and around the small petting zoo. We started with the usual attractions, the hay maze, the apple cider stand, the tractor display. I took photos of Tyler climbing on the old tractors, his orange jacket bright against the faded green paint. He was laughing, showing that gap where he'd lost his first tooth the week before. Around noon, we headed to the main pumpkin field behind the barn. The field stretched out toward the tree line, rows of pumpkins extending into the distance. I was adjusting my camera settings when Tyler tugged at my sleeve, asking about the special pumpkins he'd seen someone carrying behind the barn. I told him we'd check it out after getting some photos. The lighting was perfect, and I wanted to capture him searching for pumpkins like I had photos of his mother doing years ago. I looked down to change lenses just for a moment. When I looked up, he was gone. The panic was immediate but controlled. I called his name, scanning the field methodically. Other parents looked up, recognizing that tone all parents know, the one that tries to stay calm while your heart races. A woman pointed toward the barn, saying she'd seen an orange jacket heading that way. I jogged toward the barn, calling Tyler's name. The barn was old but well maintained, its red paint fresh despite the building's age. As I rounded the corner to the back, I caught a whiff of something that stopped me cold. It wasn't the usual farm smells, hay, animals, dirt. This was deeper, earthier, like freshly turned soil mixed with something sweet and wrong. Tyler was standing near a small door in the barn's foundation, talking animatedly to someone I couldn't quite see in the shadows. He turned when I called him. His face lit up with excitement as he told me about the farmer who was showing him special pumpkins that grew in the dark. I rushed forward, that smell getting stronger with each step. As I got closer, I saw there was no one else there, just shadows and old farm equipment. But Tyler kept pointing to the doorway, insisting the old farmer was right there, wearing black clothes and promising to show him pumpkins that glowed in the dark. When I grabbed Tyler's hand to lead him away, his skin was ice cold, like he'd been holding on to frozen metal. He resisted leaving, saying the farmer wanted to show him more pumpkins in the basement where they grew special. His voice had a strange tone I'd never heard before, distant and dreamy. At the car, Tyler's hand gradually warmed up, and his usual personality returned. He chattered about the regular pumpkins we'd seen, seemingly forgetting about the farmer and the special ones. But that smell lingered in my nose, and I noticed dark soil on the sleeve of his jacket, though we hadn't been anywhere near the ground. That evening, while drawing with his crayons, Tyler produced a picture of what he called the pumpkin farmer. The figure was drawn entirely in black crayon, unnaturally tall and thin. Behind it were round shapes that Tyler said were the special pumpkins, also drawn in black. Curious and unsettled, I researched Thompson's farm's history. The farm had been in the Thompson family since the 1800s, passed down through generations. The last actual Thompson to run it was Edgar Thompson, who disappeared in 1963. According to old newspaper articles, he'd been obsessed with developing new pumpkin varieties, spending more and more time in the barn's root cellar with his experiments. The farm had been sold outside the family after Edgar's disappearance. The new owners kept the name for tradition, but demolished the old farmhouse. The barn remained original, though the root cellar had been sealed off decades ago. A photo in one article showed Edgar Thompson standing proudly beside his barn, tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. Tyler continued drawing the farmer in black crayon, always the same way, tall, thin, standing among dark pumpkins. His preschool teacher mentioned the drawing seemed unusually detailed for his age, especially the farmer's face with its deep-set eyes and wide smile. Last week, Tyler asked when we could go back to see the special pumpkins. He said the farmer visits him sometimes, standing in his doorway at night promising to show him how to grow pumpkins that never rot. I installed a motion sensor nightlight in his room and started sleeping in the chair beside his bed. The farm's website shows they've closed the back area of the barn for renovations. The photos show construction equipment and fresh concrete where that small door used to be. Comments on their social media mention a strange smell near the barn, described as earthly and sweet. Tyler's most recent drawing shows the farmer with other children, all holding black pumpkins. When I asked who they were, he said they were the farmer's special helpers who lived in the basement with the growing pumpkins. He drew them all wearing old-fashioned clothes, like from the photos I'd seen from the 1960s. I've stopped taking Tyler to any farms. The photos from that day show him smiling on tractors, playing in the hay maze, but there's one I don't remember taking. It's slightly blurry, shot from behind the barn, showing Tyler talking to someone just out of frame. In the background, that small door stands open, revealing only darkness beyond. Driving Uber wasn't my dream job, but after getting laid off from my accounting position during COVID, it paid the bills. I usually worked day shifts around Boston, but Halloween meant surge pricing and better tips, so I decided to do a late-night run. The local colleges always had big parties, and drunk students in costumes meant easy money, or so I thought. I'd been driving since 6 p.m., watching the city transform as night fell. Early evening brought families with trick-or-treaters, then college kids heading to parties, and finally the late-night crowd stumbling home. My car had seen it all. Glitter from fairy costumes, fake blood from zombies, and enough spilled drinks to make me grateful for the seat covers I'd invested in. Around 2 a.m., I got a pickup request from a residential area in Brookline. Most rides at this hour stayed close to the party districts, but the surge pricing was high, and the passenger had a good rating. Despite my usual rule about avoiding quiet neighborhoods late at night, I accepted the ride. The street was lined with old Victorian houses, their Halloween decorations casting strange shadows in my headlights. Motion sensor skeletons triggered as I drove past, and a few jack-o'-lanterns still flickered on porches. I double-checked the address, 1247 Maple Street, while trying to ignore how the houses seemed to loom over my car. She appeared beside the car, so suddenly I jumped. The nurse costume she wore was covered in blood, not the bright fake red from party stores, but darker, with a metallic smell that hit me when she opened the door. Her makeup was smeared, like she'd been crying or running in the rain, though it was a clear night. Something about her movement seemed off, too mechanical, like someone trying to act natural. As soon as she got in, she started checking the back window. I caught her reflection in my rearview mirror, young, maybe early 20s, with shaking hands and smeared mascara. The blood on her costume looked wet in places, leaving small marks on my back seat. When she gave me the destination address near Boston University, her voice trembled slightly. We were about 5 minutes into the ride when I noticed headlights behind us, maintaining a consistent distance. Not unusual for a main road, but the passenger's reaction made my skin crawl. She went completely still, then started crying quietly. Her hands kept moving between her phone and the window, like she couldn't decide whether to call someone or keep watching behind us. Her voice shook as she begged me to take a different route. Something in her tone made me agree immediately. I turned onto a side street, but the headlights followed. They matched our speed perfectly, maintaining that same distance no matter how many turns I took. The few other cars on the road passed normally, but these lights stayed fixed behind us. I tried making conversation, asking if she needed help or wanted me to call someone. She just kept watching the back window, occasionally wiping her eyes. The makeup came away easily, but the blood on her costume stayed wet, dripping onto my car's upholstery. The metallic smell grew stronger, mixing with the lingering scent of other passengers' Halloween costumes. We turned onto Commonwealth Avenue, usually busy but empty at this hour. The headlights stayed with us, and I noticed they never seemed to get closer to my taillights, even when I slowed down. I took random turns through residential areas, but they matched every move. The passenger had stopped crying and was now texting frantically on her phone. The screen's glow illuminated her face, showing fresh scratches along her neck that her costume's collar had hidden. Her hands shook so badly she kept mistyping, deleting and rewriting messages I couldn't quite see. The blood on her costume had spread, seeping into my seat's fabric. Suddenly, she screamed for me to turn right. I reacted instinctively, cutting across 2 lanes. The car behind us missed the turn, its headlights finally disappearing into the night. The passenger slumped in relief, then directed me to a different address than the original destination. Her voice had changed, becoming steadier but somehow hollow. I dropped her off at an apartment building in Brighton. She practically ran inside, not even waiting for her receipt. The blood on my seat was still wet, soaking through to the foam beneath. It wasn't until my next pickup that I noticed her phone on the back seat, its screen still lit with unsent messages. The phone was unlocked. The screen showed an open message thread with dozens of missed calls. The last received message read, "You can't hide. We know your costume." The photo gallery was open to images from what looked like a hospital Halloween party. In the later photos, someone had been following her with a camera. The final image showed her getting into my car, taken from the vehicle that had been behind us. I called the police. They took my statement and the phone, but the address where I'd picked her up didn't exist. That block of Maple Street ended at 1245. The apartment building where I dropped her off was under renovation, completely vacant according to the manager. The detective called a week later. The blood in my car was real, but they couldn't trace its source. The phone's data was mostly corrupted except for those last few photos. They found similar reports from other rideshare drivers on Halloween nights, young women in nurse costumes, always with real blood, always being followed. I switched to day shifts after that. The stains never came out of my back seat, and that metallic smell lingers no matter how many times I clean it. The detective stopped calling after a month. The case is still open, but they've found nothing concrete. Every Halloween, I check the local news for stories about missing women or strange encounters with nurses. There's always something: a blood-stained costume found in a hospital parking lot, a ride-share driver reporting a similar passenger, a security camera catching someone being followed. But they never find anything more than that. Just blood, corrupted phones, and drivers who switch to day shifts. Moving to Portland meant starting fresh after my divorce. After 15 years of corporate life in Seattle, the change felt necessary. My ex-husband kept the modern house in the suburbs, and I found myself drawn to Portland's quirky, historic neighborhoods. The city's reputation for vintage shopping was a bonus. All those stores filled with pieces of the past, perfect for furnishing my new apartment and building the eclectic wardrobe my new job at the art gallery required. I'd spent my first week exploring downtown, mapping out coffee shops and bookstores, trying to feel less like a tourist in my new home. That's how I found Madame Vesper's Vintage Vault, tucked between a craft brewery and a record store. The building was old brick, probably from the 1800s, with large windows full of mannequins wearing clothes from different eras. A hand-painted sign advertised Halloween Costume Collection, basement level, in fading gold letters. The main floor was exactly what you'd expect from a vintage store: racks of clothing organized by decade, glass cases displaying jewelry and accessories, and that distinct smell of old fabric and wood polish that all these shops seem to share. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, catching the sequins on evening gowns and making them sparkle like stars. The owner matched her store perfectly, an elderly woman wearing layers of flowing scarves, her silver hair pulled back in an intricate braid. She sat behind an antique desk, reading a leather-bound book that looked as old as she was. She barely looked up when I walked in, just pointed toward the basement stairs when I asked about the Halloween collection. The staircase protested with each step, wooden treads worn smooth from decades of use. The handrail felt cool under my palm, its varnish long gone, replaced by the natural polish of countless hands. The temperature dropped noticeably as I descended, and the sounds from the street above faded into silence. The basement was larger than I expected, extending under what must have been the neighboring building as well. Bare bulbs hung from exposed pipes, creating pools of yellow light between long shadows. The ceiling was low, making the space feel intimate but slightly claustrophobic. Racks of costumes stretched into the dimness, everything from elaborate Victorian gowns to movie character outfits from the 1980s. Each piece had a small tag with its era and original purpose. Some were marked as theatrical costumes from old Portland playhouses, others as personal wardrobes donated by local families. The tags told stories: worn at the Paramount Theater's 1952 production of Macbeth, or from the estate of Margaret Wheeler, Portland socialite, circa 1935. The nurse's uniform caught my eye immediately. It hung slightly apart from the other costumes, the white fabric almost glowing in the basement light. Unlike the theatrical pieces, this was authentic, a real nurse's uniform from the 1960s, according to its tag. It had been worn at Portland General Hospital before the building was demolished. The fabric felt crisp despite its age, like it had been recently pressed, and carried a faint antiseptic smell beneath the usual mustiness of vintage clothing. A full-length mirror stood at the end of the rack, one of those old-fashioned ones with an ornate frame darkened by age. The glass had that slight waviness you see in ancient windows, making reflections look slightly distorted. I held the uniform up against myself, admiring how the style seemed both vintage and timeless. The starched collar and cuffs spoke of an era when medical professionals carried a different kind of authority. The basement's silence felt heavier suddenly, pressing against my eardrums like being underwater. In the mirror's reflection, I caught movement between the racks behind me, just a flicker, like someone quickly stepping back into shadow. The overhead lights seemed dimmer, though I hadn't heard any electrical buzz or seen them flicker. When I turned to look, the aisle was empty. Just shadows playing tricks, I told myself, a natural effect of the basement's unusual lighting. But when I looked back at the mirror, I saw them, figures standing motionless between the costumes. They wore medical uniforms, old-fashioned ones like you'd see in photos from the 1960s. The mirror's aged surface made their features unclear, but I could tell they were watching me. The basement air turned cold enough to make my breath visible in small clouds. The figures in the mirror moved closer, but the aisles behind me remained empty when I checked. I felt something brush against my neck, cold, like someone pressing frozen fingers against my skin. The sensation was specific, deliberate, each fingertip distinct as they wrapped around my throat. I hung the uniform back quickly, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. In the mirror, the figures had gathered around where I stood. One reached toward my reflection, and I felt that cold pressure on my neck again, stronger this time. The antiseptic smell grew overwhelming, mixed with something metallic and organic that made my stomach turn. Upstairs, the owner didn't look up as I hurried past. She just called out "interested" in a tone that made my skin crawl, knowing, almost amused. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright, and my neck had started to burn where those phantom fingers had touched. By evening, a distinct handprint had appeared, red and raised like a burn or allergic reaction. I took photos to document it, watching it fade over the next few days. My doctor suggested contact dermatitis from old fabric, but the mark was too precise, too clearly shaped like fingers wrapping around my throat. The skin felt different there, slightly cooler than the surrounding area. I researched Portland General Hospital's history, telling myself I was just curious about the uniform's origin. The building was demolished in 1970 after a series of unexplained incidents in the psychiatric ward. Old photos showed nurses in uniforms identical to the one I'd found. The articles mentioned unusual treatment methods and unexplained patient deaths, but details were vague, hidden behind bureaucratic language and sealed records. The handprint took weeks to fade completely. Sometimes it still burns, especially when I pass old buildings downtown. I've seen Madame Vesper's open since then, but the basement remains closed. A small sign saying, "Special collection by appointment only," hanging in the window. The displays upstairs change regularly, but that nurse's uniform never appeared among them. Last week, while sorting through photos from that time period, I found the ones I took of the handprint. The marks are clear. 5 distinct fingers wrapped around my throat in a way that matches the control techniques mentioned in those old hospital documents. The store closed shortly after my visit, and the building remains empty. I still feel that cold pressure on my neck whenever I walk past, and I've noticed other people unconsciously rubbing the same spot as they hurry by the papered-over windows. Moving to Portland meant starting fresh after my divorce. After 15 years of corporate life in Seattle, the change felt necessary. My ex-husband kept the modern house in the suburbs, and I found myself drawn to Portland's quirky, historic neighborhoods. The city's reputation for vintage shopping was a bonus. All those stores filled with pieces of the past, perfect for furnishing my new apartment and building the eclectic wardrobe my new job at the art gallery required. I'd spent my first week exploring downtown, mapping out coffee shops and bookstores, trying to feel less like a tourist in my new home. That's how I found Madame Vesper's vintage vault, tucked between a craft brewery and a record store. The building was old brick, probably from the 1800s, with large windows full of mannequins wearing clothes from different eras. A hand-painted sign advertised Halloween costume collection, basement level, in fading gold letters. The main floor was exactly what you'd expect from a vintage store. Racks of clothing organized by decade, glass cases displaying jewelry and accessories, and that distinct smell of old fabric and wood polish that all these shops seem to share. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, catching the sequins on evening gowns and making them sparkle like stars. The owner matched her store perfectly, an elderly woman wearing layers of flowing scarves, her silver hair pulled back in an intricate braid. She sat behind an antique desk, reading a leather-bound book that looked as old as she was. She barely looked up when I walked in, just pointed toward the basement stairs when I asked about the Halloween collection. The staircase protested with each step, wooden treads worn smooth from decades of use. The handrail felt cool under my palm, its varnish long gone, replaced by the natural polish of countless hands. The temperature dropped noticeably as I descended, and the sounds from the street above faded into silence. The basement was larger than I expected, extending under what must have been the neighboring building as well. Bare bulbs hung from exposed pipes, creating pools of yellow light between long shadows. The ceiling was low, making the space feel intimate but slightly claustrophobic. Racks of costumes stretched into the dimness. Everything from elaborate Victorian gowns to movie character outfits from the 1980s. Each piece had a small tag with its era and original purpose. Some were marked as theatrical costumes from old Portland playhouses, others as personal wardrobes donated by local families. The tags told stories, worn at the Paramount Theater's 1952 production of Macbeth, or from the estate of Margaret Wheeler, Portland socialite, circa 1935. The nurse's uniform caught my eye immediately. It hung slightly apart from the other costumes, the white fabric almost glowing in the basement light. Unlike the theatrical pieces, this was authentic, a real nurse's uniform from the 1960s, according to its tag. It had been worn at Portland General Hospital before the building was demolished. The fabric felt crisp despite its age, like it had been recently pressed, and carried a faint antiseptic smell beneath the usual mustiness of vintage clothing. A full-length mirror stood at the end of the rack, one of those old-fashioned ones with an ornate frame darkened by age. The glass had that slight waviness you see in ancient windows, making reflections look slightly distorted. I held the uniform up against myself, admiring how the style seemed both vintage and timeless. The starched collar and cuffs spoke of an era when medical professionals carried a different kind of authority. The basement's silence felt heavier suddenly, pressing against my eardrums like being underwater. In the mirror's reflection, I caught movement between the racks behind me, just a flicker, like someone quickly stepping back into shadow. The overhead lights seemed dimmer, though I hadn't heard any electrical buzz or seen them flicker. When I turned to look, the aisle was empty. Just shadows playing tricks, I told myself, a natural effect of the basement's unusual lighting. But when I looked back at the mirror, I saw them, figures standing motionless between the costumes. They wore medical uniforms, old-fashioned ones like you'd see in photos from the 1960s. The mirror's aged surface made their features unclear, but I could tell they were watching me. The basement air turned cold enough to make my breath visible in small clouds. The figures in the mirror moved closer, but the aisles behind me remained empty when I checked. I felt something brush against my neck, cold, like someone pressing frozen fingers against my skin. The sensation was specific, deliberate, each fingertip distinct as they wrapped around my throat. I hung the uniform back quickly, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. In the mirror, the figures had gathered around where I stood. One reached toward my reflection, and I felt that cold pressure on my neck again, stronger this time. The antiseptic smell grew overwhelming, mixed with something metallic and organic that made my stomach turn. Upstairs, the owner didn't look up as I hurried past. She just called out "interested" in a tone that made my skin crawl, knowing, almost amused. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright, and my neck had started to burn where those phantom fingers had touched. By evening, a distinct handprint had appeared, red and raised like a burn or allergic reaction. I took photos to document it, watching it fade over the next few days. My doctor suggested contact dermatitis from old fabric, but the mark was too precise, too clearly shaped like fingers wrapping around my throat. The skin felt different there, slightly cooler than the surrounding area. I researched Portland General Hospital's history, telling myself I was just curious about the uniform's origin. The building was demolished in 1970 after a series of unexplained incidents in the psychiatric ward. Old photos showed nurses in uniforms identical to the one I'd found. The articles mentioned unusual treatment methods and unexplained patient deaths, but details were vague, hidden behind bureaucratic language and sealed records. The handprint took weeks to fade completely. Sometimes it still burns, especially when I pass old buildings downtown. I've seen Madame Vesper's open since then, but the basement remains closed, a small sign saying "Special Collection by Appointment Only" hanging in the window. The displays upstairs change regularly, but that nurse's uniform never appeared among them. Last week, while sorting through photos from that time period, I found the ones I took of the handprint. The marks are clear, 5 distinct fingers wrapped around my throat in a way that matches the control techniques mentioned in those old hospital documents. The store closed shortly after my visit, and the building remains empty. I still feel that cold pressure on my neck whenever I walk past, and I've noticed other people unconsciously rubbing the same spot as they hurry by the papered-over windows. Moving into my first house meant finally having space for proper Halloween decorations. After years in apartments with just window clings and a plastic pumpkin, I wanted to go all out. The problem was budget. New decorations were expensive, especially the vintage-style ones I loved. That's how I found myself browsing Facebook Marketplace in early October. The listing caught my eye immediately. Vintage Halloween collection, 1960s, 1980s, local pickup only. The photos showed exactly what I wanted. Paper decorations, cardboard cutouts, old plastic pumpkins with light cords, even some of those blow-mold decorations that are impossible to find nowadays. The price was surprisingly reasonable. The seller, Margaret, responded quickly to my message. Her profile showed an elderly woman with a kind smile, though the photo looked dated. She explained these were her personal decorations collected over decades, but she was downsizing and couldn't keep them. We arranged pickup for the next day. She'd leave everything on her porch since she'd be out. The house was in an older neighborhood across town, one of those areas where each home had its own character. Margaret's house sat back from the street, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. It looked vacant with peeling paint and untrimmed grass, but the decorations were neatly boxed on the covered porch, just as promised. Loading the boxes into my car, I noticed how carefully everything had been packed. Tissue paper protected the fragile items, and each box was labeled with its contents and approximate year. The cardboard was old but solid, some boxes featuring retail logos I hadn't seen since childhood. At home, I started unpacking on my living room floor. The collection was even better than the photos showed. Cardboard witches with jointed limbs, paper jack-o'-lanterns with accordion fold bodies, plastic skeletons that glowed under blacklight, all in remarkable condition for their age. The first Polaroid fell out of a folded paper decoration. It showed a family Halloween party, probably from the 1970s based on the clothing. Nothing unusual, just people in costumes standing around a decorated living room. I set it aside, thinking Margaret had accidentally mixed in personal photos. More Polaroids appeared as I continued unpacking. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family gatherings, typical snapshots spanning decades. Then I found the recent ones. They showed my house, taken from various angles outside. My car in the driveway, my living room through the windows, my bedroom light on at night. The timestamps on these photos were current, within the past month. Some angles could only have been taken from my bedroom window on the second floor. One showed me unpacking boxes the day I moved in, taken from inside my house. Another captured me sleeping, definitely shot from my bedroom doorway. I called the police. While waiting, I researched the address where I'd picked up the decorations. Property records showed Margaret Wilson had owned the house for 50 years before passing away in 2018. The house had been vacant since then, tied up in estate issues. The officers took the photos and my statement. They were particularly interested in the ones taken inside my house, though they found no signs of break-in. My security system showed no triggers, and my cameras hadn't caught anything unusual. They increased patrols in my neighborhood but found nothing suspicious. The investigation revealed disturbing details about Margaret Wilson. She had indeed been a photographer, but her work went beyond simple school photos. Former neighbors described her as obsessive about documenting the neighborhood, often seen taking photos from her second-story windows. Police found complaints dating back to the 1980s about her photographing people without permission. After her death in 2018, the estate sale manager reported that Margaret's house contained thousands of photographs, boxes and albums filled with images of neighbors, local families, and community events spanning decades. Most concerning were the photos taken through windows and from hidden vantage points. The collection disappeared before it could be properly cataloged. I kept finding more Polaroids mixed in with the decorations. Some showed previous owners of my house, always photographed without their knowledge. The timestamps progressed through years, different families coming and going, all captured from the same angles I'd seen in my photos. The detective suggested Margaret had likely been watching my house long before I moved in. The police investigation expanded when 3 other people came forward. They'd all bought items from Margaret's porch recently, and all found similar photos hidden in their purchases. One woman discovered pictures of her teenage daughter's bedroom, taken through a second-story window. Another found images of his family at the local park, dated years before he'd bought his vintage items. My security cameras caught something unusual one night. A brief flash of light from Margaret's old house, like a camera flash. Police investigated but found the house securely locked, with no signs of entry. The property manager confirmed no one had accessed the house since Margaret's death, yet fresh footprints marked the dusty floors of the second-story rooms facing my house. I packed away the Halloween decorations, donating most to a local thrift store. Some items I couldn't bring myself to keep. The cardboard figures that seemed to face my bedroom, the plastic pumpkins that reminded me too much of camera lenses. The Polaroids went to the police as evidence. The investigation never found concrete answers. Margaret's camera collection was never recovered. The detective suggested someone might have taken her equipment and continued her disturbing hobby, but that didn't explain the older photos or the timestamps. The case remained open but inactive. I still live in my house, but I've made changes. New curtains block all windows, especially at night. Security cameras cover every angle of the property. Sometimes I catch glimpses of light from Margaret's old house like a camera flash, but I've learned not to look too closely. The police have a file ready if I ever find more photos, but so far the Polaroids have stopped appearing. Last month, the city finally approved demolition of Margaret's house. During clearing, workers found something in the walls. Dozens of camera cases empty except for undeveloped Polaroid film. The detective called to tell me they'd found one last photo stuck to the back of a case. It showed my house, taken from her bedroom window, dated the day she died. Installing a doorbell camera seemed like overkill for my small apartment complex, but after a series of minor incidents, the property manager finally approved the request. I'd moved in 6 months earlier, attracted by the quiet neighborhood and reasonable rent. The building itself was older but well-maintained. 3 stories, 20 units, mostly occupied by young professionals and a few retired residents. The problems started small. First, it was just mail going missing. Nothing important, mostly magazines and catalogs. Then packages began disappearing from doorsteps, always during working hours when most residents were out. My favorite jacket vanished from the shared laundry room last month, along with a few other residents' clothes. Small things, but enough to create a constant sense of unease. The camera connected to my phone, sending notifications whenever someone approached my door. Most alerts were expected. Delivery drivers, neighbors collecting packages I'd held for them, maintenance staff doing their monthly checks. The property manager had installed similar cameras for other residents after the missing items reports increased. By Halloween night, I'd almost forgotten why I'd installed it. I was staying at my girlfriend's place that night, letting her roommate handle trick-or-treaters while we went to a party. The evening was typical for Halloween in our area. Groups of kids in costumes until about 9 p.m., then college students heading to parties. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the doorbell camera. Probably drunk students in the wrong building, I thought, opening the notification. The footage showed someone standing perfectly still in front of my door. Not swaying like a drunk person, not looking for apartment numbers, just standing there, facing slightly away from the camera. They wore a dark jacket that looked familiar, even in the infrared lighting. The stance was unnatural, too controlled for someone who might be lost or intoxicated. It was my jacket, the one that had disappeared from the laundry room. I recognized the worn spot on the right elbow, the slightly frayed cuff where I'd caught it on a car door. Even the small tear near the pocket that I'd been meaning to repair was visible. The person wearing it stood motionless for nearly 5 minutes, their head turned at an angle that kept their face just out of the camera's view. Then the humming started. It came through the camera's audio, a low, continuous sound that wasn't quite musical but had a pattern to it. The figure remained still except for slight movements of their shoulders, rising and falling with the humming's rhythm. The sound had an odd quality, like it was being played through water or from a great distance. I saved the footage and called the police. They took the report seriously, especially after I showed them previous reports about the missing items. The officer noted how the person seemed to know exactly where to stand to avoid being identified, suggesting they were familiar with that model of camera. They also pointed out something I hadn't noticed. The figure's height matched precisely with the door frame, indicating they were about 6 feet tall. The property manager reviewed footage from the building's security cameras. None of them caught the person entering or leaving. The timestamps showed my doorbell camera recording from 2:13 a.m. to 2:18 a.m., but the hallway cameras showed no movement during that time. The exterior cameras had captured nothing but static during those exact 5 minutes. Over the next few days, I noticed the humming outside my window at night. Always the same pattern, always starting at 2:13 a.m. Police increased patrols in the area but found nothing. My neighbors reported no unusual sounds, though Mrs. Chen next door mentioned her cat refusing to enter certain rooms at that specific time each night. The building's maintenance staff checked the exterior walls and windows, finding no signs of tampering or unusual access points. They did discover that several security lights had been unscrewed just enough to create darker areas between cameras' coverage zones. The property manager installed additional lighting and motion sensors throughout the complex. The investigation revealed similar incidents in nearby apartment buildings. Other residents reported missing clothes reappearing on unknown figures caught on security cameras. Each case involved the same humming sound, always starting at 2:13 a.m. None of the figures were ever identified, but they all demonstrated the same knowledge of camera blind spots. I started documenting everything. The humming followed a specific pattern: 13 seconds of continuous tone, 3 seconds of silence, then repeat. The sound seemed to move around the building, but recording devices only captured static. Temperature readings showed unusual cold spots near windows during these episodes. The police investigation connected these incidents to a series of similar reports from the previous year. Several apartment complexes in the area had experienced mysterious thefts followed by security camera sightings. In each case, the stolen items appeared on unidentified figures who seemed to know exactly how to avoid clear camera footage. Local news coverage brought forward more witnesses. A former resident of my building described identical experiences from 2018: missing clothes, humming sounds, figures on security footage. They'd moved out after the incidents escalated, though they wouldn't specify exactly what happened. The property manager implemented new security measures: additional cameras, reinforced locks, nightly security patrols. During the installations, they discovered that someone had created small holes in the walls between apartments, perfectly positioned to observe security camera locations. The holes were professional work, possibly made with specialized tools. I still live in the same apartment, but I've adapted. Heavy curtains block all windows. Multiple cameras cover every angle. The humming continues each night at 2:13 a.m., but it's become part of the building's ambient noise. Sometimes I catch glimpses of my jacket passing by the building's security cameras, always worn by someone who knows exactly how to avoid showing their face. The police investigation remains open but inactive. They've linked the incidents to similar cases across the city, all following the same pattern. The detective suggested these might be sophisticated burglary tactics, using psychological intimidation to drive residents out. But that doesn't explain the precise timing, the humming, or how they access buildings without appearing on any cameras. Last week, the maintenance staff found something while replacing hallway lighting: small infrared sensors hidden in the ceiling, positioned to track camera coverage patterns. The devices were professional grade, like those used in high-end security systems. The police added them to their evidence file, but we all know they won't find fingerprints or serial numbers. The humming continues every night at 2:13 a.m. My jacket appears occasionally on security footage, always worn by someone who knows exactly where the cameras are and how to avoid them. The property manager has stopped responding to complaints about the sound. Most residents have learned to ignore it, but new tenants always ask about that strange humming that starts at exactly 2:13 a.m. Working as a night janitor at Roosevelt High School wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and the hours let me take classes during the day. Most nights followed the same routine: empty trash cans, mop floors, clean bathrooms, and lockup. The old building had its quirks: creaky floors, temperamental heating system, and that musty smell common to schools built in the 1950s. Halloween meant extra work with the annual dance. The gym transformed into a haunted ballroom with fake cobwebs, paper ghosts, and strings of orange lights everywhere. The student council went all out this year, even setting up a fog machine that left everything slightly damp. By the time the dance ended at 11 p.m., the floor was a mess of punch stains, glitter, and smeared decorations. I started my cleanup around midnight, after the last teachers left. The gym felt different at night, especially with half-dismantled Halloween decorations casting strange shadows. The basketball hoops creaked slightly in the air conditioning, and leftover fog hung in corners where the ventilation couldn't quite reach. The first floor was routine, sweeping up candy wrappers, taking down decorations, mopping up spills. I'd just finished rolling up extension cords when I heard it. Laughter from upstairs, not the echoing kind that bounces through empty halls, but clear, close laughter, like kids trying to stay quiet and failing. The second floor had been closed off for renovations all semester. The administration had sealed it after finding asbestos during a routine inspection. All access points were locked and marked with warning signs. But the laughter continued, followed by the distinct sound of running feet. I radioed security, but got only static. My phone showed no service, which sometimes happened in certain parts of the building. The laughter grew louder, mixed with what sounded like children whispering. Then I saw the footprints. They appeared at the top of the main staircase, small, wet marks on the dusty floor, like someone had stepped in punch or water. The prints were child-sized, maybe from elementary school kids, and they led down the hall toward the old classrooms. What caught my attention was their clarity, perfect impressions in the dust, too well defined for normal footprints. Following protocol, I headed to the security office to report the trespassers. The footprints continued along my path, turning corners exactly where the hall cameras had blind spots. That's when I noticed the smell, metallic and sharp, like old pennies or rust, growing stronger as I followed the prints. The trail led to a section of wall between two classrooms. The footprints stopped abruptly, as if the children had walked straight into the solid surface. The metallic smell was overwhelming here, and the air felt notably colder. Something crinkled under my foot, a candy wrapper I hadn't noticed before. The wrapper was for Sugar Pops, a brand I remembered from my own childhood. The company had discontinued them in the 1980s after some controversy I couldn't quite recall. The wrapper looked fresh, though, the paper crisp and colors bright, unlike the faded vintage ones collectors traded online. I took photos of everything: the footprints, the wrapper, the wall where the prints ended. The security cameras had malfunctioned during my entire shift, showing only static. The principal arrived after my call, insisting the second floor had been locked and alarmed all night. The alarm logs confirmed this, showing no entries or exits. The maintenance staff checked the entire second floor the next day. They found no signs of entry, no broken windows or picked locks. The footprints had vanished, though that metallic smell lingered. One worker mentioned finding similar prints last Halloween, but his report had been dismissed. Research into the school's history revealed something unsettling. In 1983, 3 students had gone missing during a Halloween carnival. They were last seen heading upstairs to get decorations from a storage room. The article mentioned they'd bought candy from the concession stand. Sugar Pops were listed among their purchases. I kept the wrapper as evidence, sealed in a plastic bag. The police took it seriously enough to run tests, confirming it was authentic and manufactured in 1983. The lab technician noted the unusual preservation of the wrapper and that distinct metallic smell that seemed to cling to the plastic. The school administration did a cursory investigation of the second floor but quickly closed it, citing asbestos concerns. The security cameras were replaced, though they still occasionally show static during night shifts. The principal asked staff not to discuss the incident, especially around students. I switched to day shifts after that night. The metallic smell lingers in that second-floor hallway, strong enough that even students mention it during passing periods. Other night janitors have reported similar experiences: children's laughter, wet footprints, that same metallic odor. Each incident happens around Halloween, always on the second floor. The police file remains open but inactive. They keep the wrapper in their evidence locker, along with photos of those perfect footprints in the dust. Sometimes when I'm cleaning near that upstairs wall, I hear what sounds like children whispering about candy, but I've learned not to follow the sounds anymore. Our neighborhood's annual Halloween block party started as a way to make trick-or-treating safer for the kids. 5 years ago, some parents organized a committee, got the proper permits, and turned our quiet suburban street into a family-friendly festival every October 31st. Face painting, carnival games, a costume contest, the works. This year, about 30 families participated, decorating their yards and setting up activity stations. I helped coordinate the photography station, where parents could take pictures of their kids in costume against themed backdrops. We had a schedule of volunteer photographers, all local parents we knew, each taking 1-hour shifts. The system worked well until I noticed someone taking photos who wasn't on our list. He stood out immediately, though I couldn't pinpoint why at first. His camera looked professional enough, and he wore what appeared to be a photographer's vest. But something felt wrong about his appearance. A cheap plastic mask that didn't match the quality of his equipment, and a heavy winter coat that seemed out of place in the mild October weather. The mask was one of those basic white ones from craft stores, painted with a simple smile. It should have looked amateur, but something about the way it sat on his face made it unsettling. The coat was dark wool, the kind you'd wear in December, not during an unseasonably warm Halloween. I checked the volunteer schedule again, thinking maybe someone had added him last minute. While looking through my papers, he approached a group of children at the ring toss station. The kids didn't seem alarmed. He was taking pictures just like the other photographers, though he never asked for permission. Sarah Mitchell, one of the organizing parents, noticed him too. She walked over to check his credentials, standard procedure for anyone photographing children at the event. The way he turned to face her was too smooth, too practiced. He knew her name before she introduced herself. Not just her name. He knew which house was hers, what her daughter had dressed as for Halloween last year, where her son's bus stop was located. His voice sounded wrong coming through the mask, too clear, like he was speaking directly into her ear despite standing several feet away. Other parents noticed the exchange and moved closer. The photographer kept talking, naming children and listing details about their families, addresses, schedules, favorite toys. He knew things only residents would know, yet none of us recognized him. When someone mentioned calling the police, he just tilted his head and continued taking pictures. By the time officers arrived, he had disappeared. They found no evidence he'd been there, no footprints, no fingerprints on the games he'd touched, nothing on the security cameras neighbors had installed. But everyone remembered his voice, the way it seemed to come from everywhere at once as he listed personal details about our families. The investigation revealed nothing. No one matching his description lived in the area. The coat and mask were common items available at any store. The police checked security footage from nearby streets, but he never appeared on camera, even in shots where he should have been visible. 3 days later, the photos started arriving. Each family found an envelope in their mailbox. No postmark, no return address. Inside were professional quality photographs of their children at the party, taken from angles that seemed impossible. Pictures through windows that were too high to reach, shots from inside homes that had been locked, images from vantage points that didn't exist. The police documented everything. They tested the photos for fingerprints, traced the paper type, analyzed the image metadata. Nothing led anywhere. The only consistent detail was the quality. Every photo was perfectly composed, professionally lit, technically flawless despite the impossible angles. More photos appeared throughout November. Some showed children in their bedrooms, at school, playing in backyards. All recent, all taken without anyone noticing. Parents installed security systems, changed locks, added cameras. The photos kept coming, now showing the new security measures, taken from inside the houses. The investigation expanded when similar reports emerged from other neighborhoods, always after community events, always involving a photographer in a white mask and winter coat, always followed by photos that shouldn't exist, delivered to homes he shouldn't know about. Our neighborhood changed after that Halloween. The block party tradition ended. Parents started driving their kids to school instead of letting them walk. Security cameras and motion sensors became standard home features. The police investigation stalled, though they kept a file open for any new evidence. A few more photos appeared in the following weeks. Regular shots of our street, our increased security measures, our changed routines. Then they stopped. The photographer was never identified. The original photos remain in police evidence, along with statements from dozens of witnesses who remembered that voice listing details about our families. Sometimes new residents ask why our neighborhood doesn't do Halloween events anymore, why there are so many security cameras, why parents still get nervous when they see someone taking pictures at school functions. Most of us just say there was an incident a few years back. We don't mention the mask or the coat or the way his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once as he named our children and described our homes. The police still have an open case file, but there's nothing new to add. Just those impossible photos and the memory of a man who knew too much, standing at our block party in a cheap mask and winter coat, taking pictures we never saw him capture. Driving the last bus route of the night wasn't my first choice, but after 20 years with the transit authority, seniority had its perks. The late shift meant fewer passengers, less traffic, and a peaceful end to my day. Most drivers avoided Route 23. It wound through some rough areas before passing the hospital district and heading into the suburbs. But I'd grown comfortable with my regulars, mostly hospital staff and late-night workers heading home. The transit authority had protocols for night routes, cameras recording every angle, panic buttons within easy reach, direct radio contact with dispatch. We'd had incidents over the years: drunk passengers, attempted robberies, medical emergencies. Nothing we couldn't handle with proper training and experience. But Halloween night was different. The evening shift had been typical for the holiday. College students in costumes, partygoers heading downtown. The usual chaos of Halloween in a city. By the last run at 2 a.m., things had quieted down. The streets were empty, except for scattered candy wrappers and fallen decorations. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered their last light on darkened porches. Perfect conditions for driving. Clear skies, dry roads, good visibility. The hospital stop was routine, one I'd made thousands of times before. The shelter stood under bright security lights, the hospital's illuminated emergency entrance visible in the background. She waited alone, wearing standard white scrubs and practical shoes, the kind nurses wore for long shifts. What caught my attention was how wet she was, completely soaked, like she'd been standing in a downpour. But there hadn't been rain for days. Water dripped steadily from her uniform as she boarded, leaving small puddles on the steps. The fare card she used was hospital staff issue. I recognized the distinctive blue stripe. Everything seemed proper and normal except for her drenched appearance. She chose the seat directly behind me, though the bus was empty. The sound of water droplets hitting the floor echoed in the quiet bus. Through my mirror, I noticed her constantly checking the windows, turning to look behind the bus. Her movements were tense, like someone expecting trouble. The wet sound of her clothes shifting accompanied each turn. When I asked if everything was okay, standard procedure when a passenger seemed distressed, she mentioned someone following her from her shift. Her voice sounded strange, like it was coming through water. She described a man who'd been watching her all night from the hospital parking lot. Security had checked but found no one. Other staff members had noticed him too, always standing perfectly still, always watching. The water dripping from her clothes seemed to increase as she spoke. At the next stop I saw him, a man standing perfectly still under the streetlight, wearing dark clothes that seemed to absorb the light around him. He didn't move as we passed, but his head turned smoothly to follow the bus. The woman's breathing quickened. She'd seen him too. Her wet uniform was leaving an increasingly large puddle around her feet. 2 stops later, he appeared again, closer to the curb this time, still motionless except for his head tracking our movement. The woman whispered more details, how he'd been at the hospital for her entire shift, standing at the end of corridors, appearing in doorway reflections. Water continued dripping from her clothes, though she'd been on the heated bus for 15 minutes. Each stop, he materialized, always closer to the bus, always with that same unnatural stillness. The woman's uniform hadn't dried at all. If anything, it seemed wetter. The puddle around her feet had spread halfway down the aisle, but the water smelled wrong, more like river water than rain. That's when I remembered the stories other drivers had shared about the hospital route. Over the years, several drivers had reported picking up soaked passengers near the hospital, always on late shifts. The stories followed a pattern: wet footprints leading nowhere, water damage and empty seats, security cameras showing static. Management dismissed these as urban legends, but older drivers avoided the hospital stop after midnight. She kept talking, describing how he'd followed her through the hospital, how he'd stand at the end of halls just watching. Security cameras never caught him, though other staff had seen him. Always in the same dark clothes, always standing perfectly still. Her voice grew fainter with each detail, nearly drowned out by the sound of dripping water. The second to last stop showed him standing right at the bus door. I didn't open it. Through the glass, I could see his face clearly. Expressionless, pale, with eyes that reflected the bus lights like a cat's. The woman was shaking now, water flowing freely from her uniform, spreading across the bus floor in impossible amounts. At the final stop, she stood to leave. That's when she screamed. The man was already there waiting on the sidewalk, but something was wrong with his shape. It seemed to waver like heat distortion on summer pavement. The woman's scream cut off suddenly, and when I turned around, the bus was empty except for a large puddle of water. I followed procedure, reporting everything to transit authority and police. They found no security camera footage of the woman boarding, though my fare log showed the card swipe. The water on the bus floor tested as river water, with traces of substances common to hospital waste. No nurses were reported missing from any shifts. The investigation uncovered similar incidents dating back decades. Always the same description: a soaked nurse, a watching figure, unexplained water. The hospital's records showed multiple reports of staff members seeing a man matching the description, but security cameras never captured him. Maintenance logs detailed recurring water damage in buses on the late hospital route. I still drive Route 23, though other drivers request transfers when assigned to it. The transit authority installed new cameras and sensors. After my report, joined dozens of others. They record only static during certain times, always near the hospital stop. Maintenance has replaced the flooring 3 times due to unexplained water damage. Some nights, especially when it's quiet and dark, I catch glimpses in my mirror of someone sitting directly behind me. The seats are always empty when I check, but small puddles appear on the floor. Other passengers complain about a wet seat that never quite dries, about the smell of river water that lingers even after cleaning. The police file remains open, but inactive. They've linked similar reports across 20 years of transit records, all describing a soaked nurse and a watching figure, all involving water damage and camera malfunctions, all centered around the hospital's late-night stop. I've learned to ignore certain things during my route: the sound of dripping water when the bus is empty, the way security lights flicker as we pass the hospital, the occasional glimpse of a figure standing unnaturally still at bus stops. Some stories don't need explanations, just incident reports filed away in transit authority records, documenting the things we see on late-night routes. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow, and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.